In the battle with the slum, we win or we perish. Either wipe out the slum or it wipes out us. There is no middle way. Jacob Riis, 1902.
There was a common and widespread spirit of revolt among the people, a movement of the new generation toward more democracy. Nearly everyone felt it. Robert La Follette, 1911.
Between 1870 and 1920, 26 million immigrants came to live in the United States. After 1900, most came from Southern and Eastern Europe and settled mainly in the largest cities. Here they worked in small sweatshops and giant industrial workplaces, which boomed like they never had before. A single company, John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, controlled 90% of all oil business in the United States. Corporations conspired with each other to keep prices high and wages low, swindling consumers and workers in a single stroke. Violent labor strikes, corporate giants driving smaller operators out of business, cities plagued by crime and poverty. To many Americans, it appeared that industrialization was threatening the future of the nation. What would become of the nation's cities, flooded with new people and new problems? What would become of the nation's gigantic industries, gaining so much steam and power? What would become of the United States itself? These were the enormous questions that progressivism would try to answer. The nation was justly proud of its democratic heritage. But how could democracy survive the grave new challenges of a brave new century? Some of the first answers were provided by women. The most well-known was Jane Addams, who tried to bring the poor and the rich, the immigrant and the native-born, together under a single roof. She called it Hull House. Occupying an old building in an immigrant neighborhood of Chicago, Addams and her fellow residents provided newcomers with English lessons, employment advice, and child care. Women also pressed for expanded government services, which they called municipal housekeeping, or more commonly, progressivism.
Progressivism became a word on everyone's lips in the early 20th century. And it meant the quest to make progress, to bring about reforms that would tend to some severe problems that were plaguing American society, that were plaguing American politics, were plaguing the American economy. So progressivism meant the march for greater progress.
One good example is the child labor reform movement, where a lot of people, a lot of women especially, and social reformers got very excited about young children working in factories. In this period, often 8, 10-year-olds worked in factories, sometimes 10, 12 hours a day.
Flooding into schools, women demanded medical checkups for students. In city health departments, they promoted water purification and milk inspection. At departments of labor, they reported the illegal employment of children in sweatshops. And at departments of housing, they noted fire code and crowding violations. Joining hands with a new generation of male reformers, these progressive women saw themselves as the saviors of the United States' wretched urban poor. Often, though, the poor themselves, especially immigrants, wanted no part of progressive reform. Across the nation's cities, for example, progressives helped plan new parks and playgrounds. But immigrants and workers preferred ball fields and sandlots to the lush, landscaped gardens that the reformers had created. At schools, meanwhile, working-class Americans resented reforms such as mandatory medical inspection of children. When a young boy came home with a note complaining about his body odor, his mother sent her own curt note back. "Teacher, Johnny ain't no rose. Learn him. Don't smell him." Many immigrants also worried that progressive reformers wanted to destroy their ethnic cultures. Pushing for trained teachers, improved testing, and other reforms, the progressives argued that better schools would help Americanize the nation's newest arrivals.
In forsaking the land of their birth, immigrants forsake the customs and traditions of that land, and they have an obligation in adopting a new country to adopt the language and customs of that country. Julia Richmond, 1905.
Nowhere was the clash between progressives and immigrants greater than in the question of alcohol. Since before the Civil War, reformers had tried to rid demon rum from the nation's lips. In the progressive era, they changed their focus from the liquor itself to the place it was consumed, the saloon.
Well, the progressives, usually from upper-class backgrounds, many of them women, thought the saloon was a bad influence in the neighborhood. First of all, they saw children going into the saloons to get pails of beer. They saw sometimes prostitutes hanging out at saloons. They saw men hanging out there and spending their money when they thought they should be home.
People were living in homes that were crowded, that were damp, that were unsanitary. The saloon would be warm, it would be inviting. You could sit around and have a kind of camaraderie. For a lot of ethnic communities, the saloon was the place where you got your paycheck cashed. It was the place where you found out the local news, or you found news from home. You found out whether there were jobs available, where you made your connection to the local political parties so that you could have some leverage in elections. And just the sort of basic neighborhood hangout.
Time and time again, in private and in public, the leaders have said they are out for themselves and their own, not for the public, but for me and my friends, not for New York, but for Tammany.
Lincoln Steffens was one of the muckrakers, the journalists who exposed the waste and greed of the modern United States.
One of the famous investigations was on the U.S. Senate, called the Treason of the Senate. And the point here was that the senators were so tied to the economic powers that put them in office that they were treasonous to the interest of the United States and to the people of the United States. This article so enraged President Theodore Roosevelt that he gave a speech saying that these journalists are just going around raking muck just for muck's sake, and that's where the term muckraker comes from.
Their investigations began in the slums and led upwards to urban political bosses like New York's George Washington Plunkett. Bosses took bribes for city construction contracts or simply awarded them to their friends. Advance knowledge of a new project could be worth millions. Bosses also provided valuable services to immigrants. When they first arrived in the city, it was the boss who helped them obtain housing. In the winter, the boss provided coal. On Thanksgiving, he warmed hearts with a turkey. In return, all the newcomer had to do was vote for the boss and his party. Later on, if he was especially loyal, the boss might give him a job in the police or fire department.
They served their neighbors. In return, the neighbors voted for them. But the progressives got very angry at the bosses, thinking that they were corrupt, thinking that they took money unfairly, and so they had many campaigns to try to defeat the bosses and put in a more democratic system. In general, they failed. The bosses were so strong in most places that the progressives failed to oust them. But it led to attempts to reform the city and in many cases to pass state laws about how elections should be handled and so forth.
To free voters from boss control, the progressives introduced the secret ballot. Voting had traditionally taken place in public, so the boss knew how you voted. That way he knew whom to reward and whom to punish. Under the new system, he could never tell. Reformers also won new voter registration laws to prevent bosses from stuffing ballot boxes with invented names or paying people to vote multiple times. and reformers won stronger civil service laws, requiring cities to award police, fire, and teaching jobs according to merit. No longer could the boss simply hire his supporters. Job seekers would now be screened by tests to measure how well they would perform.
Mr. Vanderbilt, sir, does your railroad serve the public interest?
The public be damned. Of course we like to do everything possible for the benefit of humanity. But first, we see that we are benefiting ourselves.
With as much passion as they fought urban bosses, muckrakers also attacked the nation's great corporations, or trusts.
Now, if you have a trust, that is a large business working in one sector of the economy, and if you control enough of that economy, then you can raise prices. And this is why people wanted to bust trusts, because the prices were going up. And one way to do that was to break up those big companies.
Ida Tarbell's expose of the Standard Oil Company showed how its president, John D. Rockefeller, gobbled up smaller companies. Other muckrakers focused on the company's mistreatment of workers, especially children.
Crouched over the chutes, the boys sit, hour after hour. Most of them become deformed and bent-backed, like old men. Cut, broken, or crushed fingers are common. Sometimes there is a worse accident. A terrific shriek is heard, and a boy is mangled and torn in the machinery, or disappears in the chute to be picked out later, smothered and dead. John Spargo, 1906.
Upton Sinclair published a novel called The Jungle. Set in the gritty meat-packing yards of Chicago, it exposed the gruesome filth within one of the United States' fastest-growing industries.
Meat was on the floor in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had tramped and spit. Thousands of rats would race about on it. The packers would put poisoned bread out for them, and then rats, bread, meat would go into the hoppers together.